Thank you, and Tom, thank you everybody to be here. I have to make a little bit disclosure here. I never really hold a senior position at the Xinhua News Agency. When I was a senior fellow at Brookings, they invited me to be their advisor and called Senior Economic Overseer Advisor. I told Xinhua News Agency, I said, hey, I never pretend to be an economist. Why you make me an economic advisor? He said, because in China, we cannot have foreigners to be a political advisor. That's why economic advisor is the right choice for you. Having said that, and let me first start with my sincere thanks to Tom, to Asian Society, and especially to Andrew Miller. Without him, we cannot put this together. And all this started from last year, if some of you may remember. We had a little panel here on South China Sea. And after that, the event went so well, so we decided to hold a conference, academic conference, on the South China Sea issue. And by inviting the leading scholars, experts from China, Vietnam, Philippines, and of course Singapore and America to have an academic and open floor discussion about the issue. Of course, we don't pretend to find a solution for it, but we just want to examine how this issue came from in the first place and what's the possible policy options for the involved players in doing all of this. So that's where we're here now, and I cannot help to promoting my own center a little bit, and the Center on Asian Globalization focuses on several areas in our research. It's a research institute affiliated with Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. The first area is major power relations in Asian Pacific. The second area is regional institutions and regimes, like ASEAN, APEC, and so on and so forth. The third research area is so-called public goods on energy, water, environment, and so on and so forth. Last but not the least is how Asian economy developed, especially how public policy impact on the development of economy in Asia. And now come back to the South China Sea issue. We know, I don't have to say too much about its importance. And first and foremost, of course, it matters about how Asia can handle their problems. A couple of years ago, our Dean Kishore Mahbubani, wrote a book, a very famous book called Can Asians Think? Can Asians Think? But now, this is time, the South China Sea issues test can Asians talk, negotiate, and handle a very difficult problem. The second point I want to make is that, of course, if the South China Sea issue goes out of control, the entire peace and stability in the entire Asian Pacific region will be substantially undermined. That goes to my third point, that is, United States of America has vital interests in peace and development in this region. It's not because United States is a Pacific power, is actually a dominant power in Pacific, but because the entire international system in this region, ever since 1945, was actually established under the leadership of United States of America. It is this international system that guaranteed peace and stability in this region in the past 60 years. If the South China Sea issue goes out of control, this is a system that will be damaged, which is a bad news to everyone. Last but not the least, a point I want to make is that this issue also matters about integrity of international legal regime. We know that the Filipinos have brought the issue to the international tribute. Whatever outcome there would be, China has to face it, because as a rising power, this is a kind of very important moment for China, in my view, whether it will respect the international legal regimes. Having said this, my most important job, and it's also a great honor for me to do tonight, is to introduce a good friend, Ambassador Step Roy. In my view, he's the best, one of the best diplomats in the world, and also one of the best strategic thinkers that we have. And I don't have to say too much about him because his record stands out, and people here may know him better than I do. But I have to confess here, every time I listen to him, it's such a great enjoyment. And his talk is always to the point, very sharp and no nonsense. And I believe that you will all agree with me after he gives his keynote tonight. Another point I want to make here finally is that Step knows how to make people laugh. Let's join me, give him a round.
Good evening. Jing, I want to thank you for that very nice introduction, and you ended on exactly the right note. Because my real function in being here tonight is to be the warm-up for the very interesting panel that we are going to have immediately following my remarks. But I want to begin by saying how nice it is to be back at the Asia Society. The Asia Society has been going through a remarkable transformation in recent years, where it has expanded its horizon to covering some of the most fascinating and difficult foreign policy issues facing our country. And the fact of its emerging stature in this area was reflected in the decision by National Security Advisor Tom Donilon to use the Asia Society in New York as the platform for his very important speech on U.S.-Asian policy on Monday of this week. Now, in serving as the warm-up, or as the clown before the circus performance, which we will shortly have, I'm violating one of the most important cardinal rules of public speaking, which is never address an audience on a topic where they know more than you do. Because when I look out here, I see that there are some very distinguished diplomatic representatives of countries bordering the South China Sea. I see Ambassador Chris Hills, former Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific, whose responsibilities for many years covered the U.S. role in the South China Sea. So I'm going to have to be very careful in not getting myself into deep trouble, but I do have one credential that I doubt that anybody else here can claim. Because in the early 1960s, I sailed through the South China Sea on a Norwegian freighter. And since there was nobody else on the freighter of any interest, I spent a great many hours staring at the waters of the South China Sea and absorbing knowledge and expertise over a period of days. So with that background, let me turn to our topic. The South China Sea has emerged as a dangerous and complex problem that is already affecting U.S. relations not only with China, but with key friends and allies in the region. For this reason, it may be useful to look at this issue in a larger context, because it brings together so many factors in international relations that are difficult to manage. First, it directly affects the growing competition between the United States and China, caused by the interplay between China's growing military capabilities and the traditional U.S. presence as a security factor in the Western Pacific. Secondly, it also touches on the interests of the Southeast Asian countries who are members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This group of Southeast Asian countries has been remarkably effective in forging an ability to put aside a host of bilateral differences in favor of working together for common purposes. However, only 4 of the 10 members of ASEAN are involved in disputed claims with China in the South China Sea. This means that the 10 ASEAN countries do not have a common interest in the South China Sea across the whole range of issues. They do have common interests, of course, in wanting peace and stability in the region, but they do not have a common interest in terms of what level of risk is appropriate in pursuing national claims. Third, other countries, such as Japan and South Korea, have fundamental interests in the South China Sea as well. A third of the world's shipping moves through the South China Sea, $5 trillion of trade passes through the South China Sea, with U.S. trade representing about 1/5 of that total. Moreover, for centuries, the South China Sea has been an international waterway not under the administrative jurisdiction of any particular country. In other words, both regional and extra-regional countries have a long tradition of using the waters of the South China Sea for unrestricted trade and commercial purposes. Fourth, the South China Sea brings into play relations between great powers and significant but lesser powers. History has taught us that major conflicts can result from great powers being drawn into disputes precipitated by lesser powers. That possibility certainly exists in the South China Sea. The maneuvering between China and the 4 Southeast Asian claimants over their respective territorial claims could give rise to disputes that affect the interests, treaty commitments, and credibility of larger countries such as the United States, that take no position on the validity of the competing claims to sovereignty over the disputed islands. The sorry fact is that the islands in the South China Sea have been a source of contention for many decades. Growing speculation regarding the oil, gas, and mineral resources that might lie in the seabed spurred neighboring countries into making ever more vigorous claims. Rising tensions in the South China Sea during the 1990s provided the backdrop for some very skillful diplomacy at the beginning of the last decade, which produced the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea in 2002 and the China-ASEAN Strategic Partnership in 2003. For a while, the various claimants seemed prepared to moderate their behavior in order to lower tensions. These hopes proved short-lived. More recently, tensions have again risen. At the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting in Hanoi in 2010, the United States declared that it had a fundamental interest in the South China Sea relating to freedom of navigation. Not surprisingly, China reacted negatively to this U.S. declaration, regarding it as unhelpful intervention by an outsider that shouldn't play a role in the dispute. The net result is that the issue of the South China Sea has become more tense and more complicated. It does not just involve oil and gas. Some 10% of the global fisheries catch occurs in the waters of the South China Sea, and fishing activities are important for the economies of the adjacent countries. In considering this question, we also need to bear in mind the background. For much of modern history, most of Southeast Asia was under colonial regimes, including all of the ASEAN claimants to disputed territories in the South China Sea. This only ended after World War II, when all of the former colonies in Southeast Asia gained their independence over a period stretching from 1946 to 1984. So the ability of sovereign states in the region to put forward claims as sovereign governments is a fairly recent development. However, the history of the region extends back for many centuries. Specialists have referred to historical records showing that India was involved in the South China Sea, for example, as long ago as 400 AD, and the Chinese have similar records. This historical background provides an additional complication. Some countries have detailed historical records extending back for millennia, while others have histories that are less well documented. But where the traditions involving their activities in the South China Sea are just as strong as the historical records. How do you handle claims partly based on proximity and partly based on historical records of uneven quality extending back for many centuries? This makes the question of conflicting claims very difficult to handle. For all these reasons, the United States finds itself in an anomalous position. On the one hand, Washington takes no position on the various claims to sovereignty over the islands and waters of the South China Sea, with two provisos. The United States insists, first, that claimants should pursue their territorial claims and accompanying rights to maritime space in accordance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And second, it insists that consistent with customary international law, legitimate claims to maritime space in the South China Sea should be derived solely from legitimate claims to land features. On the other hand, the United States is neither in a position to remain a disinterested party nor to impose its views on its friends and allies in the region. Equally relevant, the United States has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, which applies in the event of an armed attack in the Pacific area on either of the parties, including attacks on, and I quote, their armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific. So the question of whether or not the United States recognizes the Philippine claim to, say, the Scarborough Shoal is largely irrelevant, because the Mutual Defense Treaty applies if there's an attack on a Philippine ship or aircraft anywhere in the Pacific. This makes it difficult for the United States to avoid being dragged into the problem in some fashion. However, what responsibility does that give the United States for monitoring Philippine behavior? I'm just citing this as an example. If the United States does not wish to be dragged into a dispute over claims. However you answer that question, the United States is not in an easy position. With all these complexities in mind, the United States has laid out a position on handling disputes in the South China Sea that is clear and consistent. We call for restraint and diplomatic resolution. We oppose provocation. We oppose coercion. We oppose the use of force. We do not take sides on competing territorial claims, and we want disputes to be resolved peacefully and in a manner consistent with international law. I am essentially quoting there from remarks made by former Secretary of Defense Panetta at a Shangri-La conference in Singapore last year. This position is completely consistent with the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea issued by China and the 10 members of ASEAN in 2002, which I referred to earlier. Nevertheless, there is a small fly in this ointment. The United States is calling for an approach based on the rule of law, but the United States has still not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the most fundamental law governing maritime issues. This undermines our moral authority on the question. Secretary of State Kerry is intimately familiar with this issue because in his earlier position as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was involved in administration efforts to move ratification forward. One can only hope that he will continue pressing for ratification of this important treaty. Doing so, however, will not remove all sources of contention. The United States and China, for example, disagree on the nature of permissible activities in exclusive economic zones. This is a problem that will constantly plague our ability to work out satisfactory arrangements. These complications are troublesome, but there is also a bright side in the form of, again, this declaration that I keep coming back to, the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. This was not simply a routine hortatory statement. It was formally signed by all of the parties, including the foreign ministers of the 10 ASEAN members and an authorized Chinese representative. In it, the parties reaffirmed their respect for and commitment to the freedom of navigation in and overflight above the South China Sea. They undertook to resolve their territorial and jurisdictional disputes by peaceful means, without resorting to the threat or use of force, through friendly consultations and negotiations. They undertook to exercise self-restraint in the conduct of activities that would complicate or escalate disputes and affect peace and stability, and they agreed to work on the basis of consensus for adoption of a code of conduct in the South China Sea. The declaration is non-binding. A code would have greater force. So clearly something is wrong. The parties to the dispute have adhered to principles that they are not applying in their behavior patterns. This is not a problem caused by any individual country. It is a problem for all of the parties who signed the declaration. Obviously, it would be an enormous step in the right direction if the parties could make progress on the adoption of a code of conduct in the South China Sea as called for in the 2002 declaration. Troublesome as this issue is, we should bear in mind that the countries directly involved in the dispute in the South China Sea, in general, have friendly and expansive relations with each other. After all, China is the principal trading partner with many, if not most, of the countries in the region. Moreover, all of these countries want friendly relations with China, whose expanding economy is the engine of growth in East Asia. The United States cannot stay uninvolved in this problem, since we have an enormous interest, as stated by Secretary Clinton, in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. This is not simply because of trade considerations, which are substantial, but also because U.S. military vessels regularly pass through the South China Sea en route to the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia, and other destinations. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, Japan and other major trading countries have their own interests in the region. Nevertheless, there is an element in the U.S. position that needs careful attention. The United States is creating an expectation that our military presence will somehow stabilize the situation. But what if it does not? Then, if the United States does not act when a crisis occurs, it might create the mistaken impression that the United States is not reliable. But in many of the potential scenarios, the United States has no obligation to intervene, and it may not be in our interest to do so. In fact, the primary interest of the United States is in not having such clashes occur. This underlines why making progress toward concluding a code of conduct for the South China Sea is so important, if only because these disputes hold the potential for great power confrontation that would be in nobody's interest. The U.S. posture on these disputes has already had a negative impact on U.S.-China relations. A poll in China last spring by the highly respected Pew Global Attitude Survey found that the percentage of Chinese who characterize their country's relationship with the United States as one of cooperation has plummeted over the last 2 years from 68% to 39%. That's a drop of nearly 30 percentage points. 26% of those Chinese polled say the relationship between China and the United States is now one of hostility, up from 8% just 2 years earlier. A comparable Chinese poll of mainland public and elite attitudes last summer had parallel findings. Asked whether the United States is China's partner, competitor, or enemy, 27% of Chinese government officials chose enemy, while 68% chose competitor. A Pew poll in the same time frame in the United States of how American elites and public view China found that only 2% of U.S. government officials called China an enemy, while 80% called it a competitor. In other words, the nature of the island disputes in the South and East China Seas is having an asymmetrical impact on China and the United States. Most Americans do not care about these islands and can't find them on the map. The Asian claimants do care about them, with passions often running high on the question. This is not a healthy situation. In conclusion, let me again emphasize that it's important for us to give this issue careful attention. There is an enormous possibility for things to go wrong, and at the same time, there are enormous possibilities for matters to be handled in ways that will damp down tensions and not let this issue interfere with the more fundamental interests of all of the countries involved. It is difficult to come up with a scenario involving conflict in the South China Sea that will be beneficial to any of the claimants. The United States can play a constructive role, but it has to be careful not to create expectations that we will do things that we are not in a position to do or that it may not be in our interest to do. That would only make matters worse because of the great power factors that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. What is needed on the part of all of the countries involved in this question is wise and responsible behavior continuously. Thank you.
Let me plug this in first. Now is it working now? Okay. Now we are going to have a panel as planned. And the first is bad news or good news, depending which angle you look at it. General Zhu Chenghu from China unfortunately cannot make it because he is leading a PLA delegation visiting United States. And he had a very busy schedule in Washington, D.C. And as a result, he missed his train at 5 o'clock. Now I think he's somewhere in New Jersey coming here. So we're going to have a panel without him. And I can answer maybe some questions from China's perspective because after all, I'm a Chinese. And then we are going to have Ambassador Chris Hill to join us. Now, this a little bit notes here. I always believe sincerely, seriously, that had Ambassador Hill remained in his position a few years ago, the North Korean scenario may have a different outcome. I always believe that. It's a great loss. And, but of course, North Korea, we know, is on top of the priority list right now. And then we're going to have a very famous and leading scholar from Vietnam. And her name is, forgive me if I did not pronounce it right, Nguyen Thi Thai Ha. And she's a Director General of Department of International Law and Treaties from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Vietnam. And then we have another expert of international law and from Philippines, Henry Besuto. Is he here? Yes, great. And he's actually the brain or mastermind of this case, brilliantly done by the Filipinos to bring the case to the International Tribunal. So we are very fortunate to have him with us. And then that's about it. And did I miss anyone? No. So please join me, welcome them to up the stage.
So we're, hi.
Yeah, you have
where do you-
names.
Oh, we have our names. Okay.
Yeah, have names.
Great.
Yeah.
Hi.
And
How are
the rules tonight is that each one of them are going to have, I believe, about 10 to
you? Have a seat.
10 minutes. Or no, right now about 15 minutes to make their commentary remarks on the issue. And then the floor is going to open for questions and answers, including the questions to Ambassador Roy, who just gave us a wonderful keynote. Okay, let's start from Henry. Okay, start from this way. Is that okay?
Sure.
Or we should go lady first?
No.
Okay, Henry, you go first then.
Hi, hello. Hi, good evening. First, I'd like to express my appreciation to the organizers for the opportunity to actually engage on this issue. Second is invoking the modified Chatham House rules. I'll be as candid as I can. If I make a mistake, then it's my personal liability, but if I say the right thing, then it's my government. Having said that, let me emphasize at the outset that our relations with China, if not for the South China Sea, would have been excellent, actually. And that's the direction that we would like to go. We would like to walk 100 years of relationship with China. That's our goal, that's our objective. That's the most logical, natural objective of any country that neighbors with China. But as we walk that 100 years, we would like that relationship to be based on solid fundamental principles of mutual respect for each other. And we would like to shake hands with our Chinese friends. But it is very difficult, actually, to shake hands when your friend's foot is on your foot. It makes it very difficult to smile when your friend's foot, while you shake hands, is on your foot. In this case, it's the South China Sea issue, or the 9-dash line, which is that foot over my foot. And I think while we say that the South China Sea constitutes not the sum total of our relations, unfortunately, it has the effect of a toothache. Small, yet affects the whole body. And therefore, it is something that you cannot deny. It is something that you cannot just put aside, sweep under the rags. It is something that we both have, all of us, have to put our energy, our mind, to actually settle and manage the dispute so that it doesn't escalate into a conflict. And it is this very reason why the Philippines actually has implemented a 3-track approach in this issue. We have the political, diplomatic, and the legal. In the political, we have put as many initiatives that we could put on the table to actually explore the possibility of peacefully engaging not just China, but also the other claimant states, and so that we could have a peaceful management of the issue. For example, we have put forth an initiative that is called, for example, the Zone of Peace, Freedom, Friendship, and Cooperation. This was put officially on the table of ASEAN. We have also officially called for a workshop among all the claimant states, not just the claimant states from ASEAN, but inviting China to that table as well. Then we have also put forward the initiative of, within ASEAN, the 4 claimant states, so that hopefully not all ASEAN countries are directly involved with the issue. And definitely, if you look at the issue, it's a concentric circle, and the core of that would be the claimant states themselves. And therefore, the solution would have to come from the claimant states themselves. We have been pushing hard also for the code of conduct. We have actually engaged with our colleagues, our brothers from ASEAN, so that hopefully one day we could have a code of conduct. But from our perspective, it is not just a code of conduct by name. It must contain the right ingredients and the right elements for that to be effective. It must be a move forward, and therefore it must be a code that is more than the declaration of conduct. Because if it is just a declaration of conduct, then there's no point in having a code of conduct. Because the declaration has not prevented the tension that has affected all of us in the South China Sea for the last 3 years. And therefore, it must have fundamental elements that would address the very issues, the very gaps that the Declaration of Conduct was not able to provide. It must be legally binding. It must be consistent with international law. It must have dispute settlement mechanisms that would allow the parties actually to engage each other in an objective, definitive way, and not just based actually on the concept of might makes right. For us, just like the United States, our whole approach on the issue is rules-based. For us, the rule of law is actually the great equalizing factor, that it levels the playing field both for big power and small power. This is a lesson that we have learned actually in the South China Sea. And from our end, what we have seen, and this issue, if you look at it as an issue in its entirety beginning in the 70s, when Parasols was taken over actually from the Vietnamese, we did not say a word actually because we thought it's a bilateral issue and we did not want to engage on an issue that concerns the two countries. We have no claim on the Parasols. But there's another issue there, the issue of the use of force. Yet we kept quiet. Then, 10 years after, sometime in the 80s, this happened again in the Fiery Cross Reef. Again, because this is a bilateral issue, we kept quiet because this is a bilateral issue, even if force was applied. Because objectively, when you look at it, even if you don't engage, you're not involved in the bilateral territorial issue, the issue of the use of force is something that actually concerns us and everybody. And this is what we have learned. Come the 1990s, it was our turn. It was our turn, actually, with Mischief Reef. Now we find ourselves at the end of the totem pole. That the very issue that we kept quiet about, now we are facing it ourselves. And from the 1990s, a decade after, despite the Declaration of Conduct, we have the issue of the Reed Bank. Then from the Reed Bank, which is about 85 nautical miles, a year after, we have the issue of oil blocks 3 and 4, which are 60 and 30 nautical miles away from Palawan. Then in 2012, we have the issue of the Scarborough Shoal. So from this, what we have learned actually is that we have to do something in terms of developing the culture of law. That force, actually, and intimidation are issues that are not appropriate in the modern day world. And this is what we are trying to say. This is also the bottom line behind our action of going through arbitration. Arbitration is not an unfriendly act. In fact, there's a UN convention that says dispute settlement mechanism actually is a friendly act. And this is what it's all about. It is a friendly act. This is a peaceful way of settling disputes based on the concept of rule of law. Objectively, if we lose, we should be graceful enough to accept that. If the other party also loses, they should be graceful to actually. This arbitration also provides the opportunity for our friend from the North to actually explain itself. This is an opportunity to show to the world that there is a strong rule of law that is now prevailing in the South China Sea. And this is the new world order that our neighboring country, the North, should try to aspire for because it is a superpower already. And so hopefully the arbitration will provide the opportunity for us to actually settle and manage the dispute in a way that they would not actually escalate into a conflict. On the Code of Conduct, the arbitration also provides, complements and supplements the Code of Conduct. The two concepts are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they supplement and complement each other. What one could not provide, the other could actually provide, and therefore they supplement each other. And hopefully, the arbitration would push through its logical conclusion in a way and in a manner that would somehow provide some durable solution to the issues in the South China Sea. And we are also advocating that hopefully we could kickstart as soon as possible the negotiation and the conclusion of the Code of Conduct with China in the South China Sea. I think I'll stop there, and hopefully if there are some questions, then I will try to amplify. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I come from Vietnam, and everybody knows that we have a land territory with a long coast, and we also have sovereignty over offshore islands that we recognize that are disputed by other countries. So our government is always maintain the position that we try to settle all disputes in accordance with international law, and with issues relating to the maritime zones, we keep consistent to the provisions of the United Nations Convention to the Law of the Sea, to which most of the coastal states in the South China Sea are parties to. For us, we think that it is very, very important to be able to conduct peaceful negotiation when we want to find solutions for disputes, especially disputes relating to sovereignty and to maritime jurisdiction. We have made quite some successful in our efforts to settle disputes with our the neighboring friends. Like between Vietnam and China, we have been able to reach agreements for the delimitation of the boundary in the Tonkin Gulf. Between Vietnam and Indonesia, we were able to delimitate the boundary between of the continental shelf between the two countries. And between Vietnam and Malaysia, we reached an agreement for joint development of oil in the overlapped continental shelf between the two countries. So those successful experience show us that it is very, very important if in a dispute we can continue the possibility of having peaceful negotiation. The peaceful negotiation on these disputes could be very, very difficult. We have had negotiation, for example, in the delimitation of the continental shelf between Vietnam and Indonesia for more than 20 years, but finally we reached agreement. So we think that peaceful negotiations are really very important. In the dispute, we have some very difficult dispute in relations to the sovereignty over the Paracels and Spratlys in the South China Sea. Why I say these disputes are very difficult because in the Paracels dispute, there are only two parties, Vietnam and China. And we have tried for many years to propose that we conduct negotiation directly with China to find solution for the dispute about the sovereignty over the Paracels. But we haven't been able to conduct negotiations, and that is as myself as a lawyer, I am very concerned about this, because when we cannot have negotiation, then it is very difficult to find solution for such a difficult issue, and we can. The other way is to bring the case to an international court, but we know that that is not possible. So. For the dispute regarding the sovereignty over the Paracel, I think it is very. I am, as a lawyer, I'm very concerned. We try our best, but negotiation is not yet possible. With regard to the Spratly, we have more than 2 parties. So if we want to have negotiation, we need the presence of all the claimants. And we haven't been able to have such negotiation. Instead, we try to conduct negotiation for a code of conduct. A code of conduct, in our view, is not a document that can bring solutions to the disputes. But a code of conduct could create a peaceful and a conducive environment for the disputed parties to try to come together and discuss the disputes and try to find solutions. But again, in the discussion of the code of conduct, the issue of the disputed areas arise. And it is like a circle. When you cannot settle the issue of sovereignty over the land territory in the middle of the sea, you cannot define the maritime entitlement for those features. And then you say that you don't know which area the code of conduct could be applied. Then the difficulty goes on. And that is one of the reasons why the first effort to try to reach agreement on the code of conduct in the 1990s was not successful, and then it became the declaration of conduct of parties. And now ASEAN and China are trying to have another code of conduct, but among ASEANs, we have been talking to each other to try to reach our common understanding of the main elements of the code of conduct, but we haven't been able to talk to China about the code of conduct. China is still saying that China is ready, but they will conduct discussion with ASEAN countries when it is ripe. And we are still waiting for the time to be ripe. In my view, as a lawyer, I think there is a very important issue in relations to the multi-party dispute over the Spratly. That is, although we have not been able to settle the issue of who owns what, but all of us are parties to the Convention on the Law of the Sea. We have provisions in the Convention that can help us to define the maritime entitlement of those disputed features. And with that, I think that if we come together, we sit down, we discuss with each other, we can try to define the disputed areas around those features. And that could be the basis for further talks about joint cooperation among the disputed parties. And I think that is also one way forward for the dispute, the difficult disputes relating the Spratlys. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I never thought I would be in front of an audience discussing the good old days of the Bush administration, but you know, we didn't have these problems. And you know, even the North Koreans at the time never threatened us with nuclear annihilation over some UN sanctions. So you can see that the pivot to Asia, I guess, was very necessary because some of the problems have become a lot worse. I must say that when I was handling these issues, one of the common refrains was the notion that China had far better diplomacy than the Americans, and China was able to work with all its partners in Southeast Asia. China was the engine of growth for Southeast Asia, and somehow the U.S. was way behind in all this. And soon we're going to see a sort of a situation where China was going to have almost exclusive relations with these countries. But something, I think, happened along the way, and that was this explicit effort, because I think China's policy with respect to the South China Sea and even the East China Sea has really not changed in decades. But I think what became explicit, that is this effort with the 9-dash line, the effort to kind of turn the South China Sea into a southern Chinese lake, I think has aroused a great deal of concern among its maritime neighbors. Ambassador Roy noted the kind of difference between public opinion in the U.S. that often doesn't even know that these issues exist versus public opinion in China. I would argue there's a similar asymmetry between public opinion in China where, I mean, for most Chinese, China is a land power, not a maritime power. And yet here it is getting into these, I think, increasingly serious problems with countries that are, I think, can be defined as maritime states. So I think China has, to some extent, started this dance and is going to have to figure out how to get out of this, because this is an area for China, I mean, notwithstanding the oil and gas and even the fishery issues, I don't think this is an area of fundamental importance to China. I think the issue for China of fundamental importance is to have good and productive relations with its neighbors, and it clearly has put those relations at in some distress. Ambassador Roy, in his keynote address, spoke about the issue of public opinion in China. And I think one of the most worrisome aspects of what is going on in China is the fact that there's this kind of growing nationalism within China. By the way, nationalism is all over the world, whether it's something in the air or, in this case, maybe something in the water is hard to say. But during these periods of kind of growing nationalism, especially in China, it is not surprising that these maritime disputes have flared up. I might add that maritime disputes are something that everyone in the world has maritime disputes, maybe with the exception of Switzerland or something. But I mean, every country has these kinds of things. And the issue is, do you have the mechanisms to kind of park the problems? Do you have the mechanisms to engage multilateral forum? Do you have the economic mechanisms to create means by which countries can cooperate while there are these disputes ongoing? And I think the answer in the South China Sea is these mechanisms are not plentiful enough and are not strong enough to sort of manage these issues during a time of heightened nationalism. I think to a great extent what we are seeing in the South China Sea and frankly what we're seeing on the Korean Peninsula for China is a kind of test of what kind of China we're going to see in the future. If China cannot manage these maritime issues with these four key neighbors, I think it bodes rather some concern about how China is going to be able to make its way as it assumes this kind of, if not superpower status, then something close to it. So I think really, I think all eyes are on China, how it manages this kind of outbreak of nationalism. I don't think China should really, or the Chinese government should try to be matching this nationalism by saying, well, wait a minute, people, we can be more nationalistic than you. I don't think that's helpful. In short, I don't think the Chinese government should, in effect, be whipping this up. And yet we're seeing this time and time again on the issue of the Japanese demonstrations. We're seeing a Chinese government that has, until now, really not been up to the challenge of calming these things down. I mean, anyone who talks to any responsible Chinese official, those Chinese officials understand their responsibility to calm this down, and yet we're not seeing a capacity to calm this down. And I think it speaks to very, very deep currents within China, very deep questions of how that government perceives its position vis-a-vis the Chinese people. These are very serious matters for China. They go much deeper, really, than the South China Sea. even deeper than the U.S. relationship or relationships with the Korean Peninsula. So, with respect to issues of trying to, resolve the problems with China, whether it's in the framework of the law of the sea or other mechanisms that have been very eloquently discussed by my colleagues on the panel, I think probably from a realistic point of view, we're not going to really get too much out of China at this time on these kinds of approaches. But I think what we can insist from China, and I think it needs to be part of the U.S.-Chinese dialogue, is to see how China can manage this nationalism and can manage really the security situation of these states. If China really persists with this kind of what do they call it, white-hulled navy that they've been using, this kind of coastal navy, which, well, looks like a navy to me, maybe painted differently, this is really a prescription for sooner or later having an incident. And we know that the worst thing about maritime problems is you have high emotions, you have those in land situations, but the sea is always a little rockier than the land, and I think you could have a situation where you have some kind of unforeseen incident. Unforeseen incidents happen at sea and they happen in the air more than they happen in land, and I don't think the Chinese really are has the expertise to manage this. So I'm very concerned about that. I know that the issue of the East China Sea goes beyond the scope of what we'll be talking about in the next 2 days, but there's some similarity there in terms of how China deals with these questions in its maritime area. So I think what the United States needs to do is, first of all, I think the policy of not speaking to the question of sovereignty issues is the right one. Even if we had a position, and I think many American officials do have a position on where the real sovereignty should be, we know that expressing ourselves on these sovereignty issues is probably not, from a pragmatic point of view, going to lead us toward a lessening of tensions. So I think the American position here should be to avoid sovereignty questions, to stay close to these countries. And by close to these countries, I think we need to avoid a situation where these countries seek to bring us in as direct participants in the dispute. I mean, we do have these security agreements. I think the U.S. understands what is required in in these security agreements. But I think a little creative ambiguity, to use I think a former boss of, maybe he's still your boss, of Ambassador Roy. I think a little creative ambiguity is probably sufficient, rather than expressly say what we feel is triggered by our treaty responsibilities. I think we also need to make sure that we have a good enough discussion or good enough means of talking to the Chinese. And for this, Americans sometimes have a little trouble in trying to set priorities because when we go over to China, we do everything, whether it's sell them soybeans or complain about their continued inability to, or unwillingness to deal with North Korea. I think we need to set some priorities. And I would put maritime disputes with 4 maritime neighbors as a priority. I also strongly subscribe to the view that it is not in American interest to see these types of disputes continue. I think it's very much opposed to our interests. I think we need to avoid situations where we can fall prey to the view in China that somehow we are, how to put it, fishing in troubled waters. I think we need to be very supportive of these countries, but do so in a way that doesn't look like we're trying to exacerbate the tensions with China. I am of the view that in the long run, the U.S.-China relationship is as important to us as the relationships we have with these other countries, certainly collectively, if not individually. I think the United States needs to maintain this kind of relationship with China, because I think we can help create the atmosphere, the means, or the milieu in which China is going to continue to rise. Those of you familiar with the think tank world in Washington, D.C. knows that everyone is talking about Thucydides, as if anyone could spell Thucydides. I mean, there is not enough time in the course of these 2 days to discuss the differences between modern China and ancient Sparta. I would argue there's also not enough time to talk about the difference between modern United States and ancient Athens. I would put aside that kind of stuff and stick with a much more pragmatic view, recognizing our long-term interest in Asia, which, by the way, started before the pivot, but I won't get going on that. A long-term interest we have in Asia, very long-term and very serious bilateral relations with many of these countries in Southeast Asia, and the fact that we need to continue to be engaged, but engaged in a very, I think Ambassador Roy put it best, a very responsible way. So, thank you.
Okay, and thank you so much. And I want, to be fair, I want to say a few words about what I understand of China's position. I could be wrong, but I think that first and foremost, China has enormous interest in South China Sea. But in my understanding, no Chinese officials or Chinese government document ever said South China Sea is China's core interests. It's an important interests, vital interests, never core interests. The reason, in my view, is very simple. China said Tibet and Taiwan are China's core interests, because Tibet had a lot of problems with China, but the international community is saying Tibet is part of China. And Taiwan has a lot of problems with mainland China, but the international community adopt one China policy. And the United States from the very beginning thinks that the Taiwan issue should be solved by people on both sides of Taiwan Strait peacefully. But China recognized, first and foremost, there are disputes in South China Sea, just like there is a dispute on Senkakus or Diaoyu. So when there is a dispute, it cannot be qualified as a core interest of China, period. And then the first and second, China does realize that it is very, very difficult to solve this issue, not just because it involves multiple parties, but also involves history, international law, and the entire scenario of difficulties. And so therefore, it's a huge problem. That's why from Deng Xiaoping to now, China's basic position remains the same. That is to shelve the dispute and try to find a way to cooperate so that to promote this ongoing economic integration in the region and to promote peace and peaceful development, quote and unquote, in Asian Pacific. That's China's fundamental position. However, we also understand that this kind of issue involves not just international politics for China, but domestic politics. Yes, China is not by no means a democratic society, but as Chinese society become more and more open and market economy prevailed in China, and Chinese society also became increasingly diversified. So public opinion does matter in China's decision making. And also another factor is that just like in all the politics, the Chinese leadership is not united as one. There are disputes, there are differences, and there are different approaches. So as a result, the weaker the top leader is, the tougher he has to be in foreign affairs and foreign policies, especially on the issue of South China Sea. We know that China just changed the leadership. The new leadership has no choice, but has to play a tougher role in South China Sea. Otherwise, it simply cannot survive internally, not just among the Chinese people, but among themselves. But having said this, I think that let me finally say something about what is exactly China's policy in South China Sea. I will summarize it in 3 lines. The first line is strategic ambiguity, and China is learning a good lesson, very well from its teacher, that is United States. A major issue like this, the big power does have advantage in maintaining the issue strategically ambiguous. That is, China will say, oh, all the water within the 9 dash line is mine. That's China's position. But if you ask China, try to pin it down, say, exactly which part is yours. And China is always ambiguous. Only say all those islands, those rocks, and the water surrounded are ours. And that's first, strategic ambiguity. Second is multilateralism for cooperation. That is, if to promote regional cooperation or economic development, China absolutely will adopt a multilateral approach, which China has adopted ever since 1997 and 1998, and China will continue to do that. And the third line is bilateralism to solve a problem or to find a solution. That is, when it comes to the dispute, China will insist to talk only to the parties that has a problem with China and not with others. Based on that, China has two so-called no's China will never do. Number one, China is firmly opposed any activities or effort to internationalize the South China Sea issue. That's a fundamental reason why China does not want to go to international tribute, because China believes if the international is involved, that's a very fundamental step towards internationalization of the dispute. For whatever reason, China does not think that's of its interest. I mean, China's leadership. And the second, of course, China does not want any so-called foreign power to intervene into this issue. Of course, that foreign power means United States of America or Japan, or to some extent even India. And I think China here is playing two-level games. The first level, of course, China tried to muscle over those small parties by the bilateral approach. Muscle over is a nice word. The real word is a bully. And on the one hand, because on one-on-one, China always is stronger than other parties. On the second level, China also believes a good relationship with the United States of America is a key to maintain stability and peace in the region. So China wants to so-called establish a new kind big power relations with the United States. I still try to figure out what this means, but that's what they're trying to do. And so last but not the least, of course, China insists on the so-called peaceful development strategy, which means under no conditions, China will fire the first shot. However, China's behavior is quite aggressive. If you just look at with Philippines and the Vietnamese, China will send in the so-called Coast Guard or surveillance patrols, just be there. That's a big guy, and China can afford to put both hands behind and just use a belly to push you, dare you to use a knife to that. Of course, there is a very huge military, not of course in terms with other Asian countries, China's military is quite overwhelming behind it, but not necessarily as a means for the solution, but as a credible deterrence to guarantee China's policy. That's it. Thank you. Now I think that Ambassador Roy, do you have any words to say? No. Okay, great. Now we still have a few minutes for questions and answers. Yes, Jerry?
Jerry Cohen, NYU's U.S. Asia Law Institute. We've heard 5 very good statements that set the stage for tomorrow's more detailed talks. I was very glad to hear Ambassador Roy's eloquent plea for the United States to finally ratify the UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Treaty. Now, we all know part of that treaty that's very important is the provision for the compulsory settlement of disputes involving interpretation and application of the treaty. The most unusual, momentous event that has occurred in recent months, certainly, involving our subject is the Philippine claim before the arbitration tribunal of UNCLOS. I didn't hear from Ambassador Roy or from the other speakers from the United States, at least. What's our position on peaceful settlement of disputes using the UNCLOS compulsory provision for adjudication or arbitration of a dispute? Is that good? Should we be encouraging that without taking sides on the outcome? But is third-party decision-making a welcome step toward breaking down this horribly difficult South China Sea problem into its various component parts? And has the Philippines done a good service by bringing this case, especially challenging the legality of the 9-dash line? Is international law useful, or is negotiation on the basis of power and other factors more important?
Go for it, State.
Jerry, it's very typical of you to hone right in on the legal niceties. To the best of my knowledge, the United States has not taken a position on the Philippine action. Since we are a signatory of UNCLOS, even though we haven't ratified it, we're technically expected to act consistent with the language of the treaty. But that doesn't get into the question of whether it's wise or not wise to bring a suit under the arbitration provisions of it. It doesn't reflect an American position, but I have heard in discussion of this question the issue raised of, with the Philippines having brought the case, that makes it almost impossible for China to agree to begin negotiations on the code of conduct, because it would look as though they were doing so under the pressure of the Philippine legal case. I don't know whether there's merit to that argument or not, but I've heard it advanced as one of the complicating factors in trying to get the negotiations, to which all of the parties have agreed in principle, started on the negotiation of a code of conduct.
You're a younger man than I, and evidently have the patience of a skilled diplomat. But how long should the Philippines wait? The code of conduct has been talked about for 11 years at least. There's no evident progress, as has been indicated by other speakers. The Philippines has been negotiating for a couple of decades on this. Its security is being threatened. How long should they wait before trying to test the legal claims of the various parties? What's reasonable here?
There's no answer to that question, Jerry. The fact of the matter is that ASEAN actually has been active over the last couple of years on the question of whether conditions are suitable for starting negotiations on the code of conduct. There have been, so far, obstacles that have prevented the negotiations from starting. In terms of diplomacy, I will make a statement which is true most of the time, but not necessarily 100% of the time. Deadlines and diplomacy, more often than not, are contradictory with each other. In diplomacy, you take as much time as is needed to reach the agreement you have to make. If a deadline is helpful in getting there, then there's a place for it. But if you try to force the process of diplomacy by setting arbitrary deadlines, more often than not, it blocks the ability to come to the agreement that you want. So essentially, there are judgment questions involved in this.
Yeah, please. No, just a quick reaction to that issue just a quick reaction to the issue of linking the arbitration with code of conduct. It's very unfortunate that there's an attempt to actually link one with the other to the extent of making one as a precondition for the other to actually proceed, meaning that as a precondition for the code of conduct to move forward, then arbitration will have to be dropped. I think that's a very unfortunate linkage, and I think we don't agree with that. Fact one, the reason why the code of conduct is not moving forward is not because of the arbitration. It is told much, much prior to the filing of the arbitration case. It would have been different if it was stalled by the filing of the case. But here, the stalling preceded the filing of the arbitration. In fact, one of the key elements that triggered the Philippines to move forward with the arbitration was the fact that nothing was happening with the Code of Conduct. Second, as I indicated earlier, the two are actually complementary with each other because not everything can be addressed by the Code of Conduct. There will be also some issues that by its very nature and by the very essence of arbitration would not be able to address. And therefore, things that the arbitration could not address will have to be addressed by the Code of Conduct. These are like two legs. We have to walk on two legs. You take out one, you cripple the stability and peace of the region. And therefore, it is imperative that you must have these two legs walking parallel in tandem with each other. Third, the Code of Conduct has become a sort of an objective, as if it's the solution, be all for everything. But as I indicated earlier, the nomenclature is one thing. The substance, what it contains, are the more fundamental issues that we have to look into. My last point on this. We cannot go on with an ad infinitum. I agree with the statement that deadline is not necessary. I think there are times when it's good, but there are times when it's not good. Circumstances will dictate what would be the right policy direction. However, an indefinite, open-ended, non-conclusion of a Code of Conduct over a period of time, long period of time, would be dangerous. Why do I say this? It is very logical to assume that the first premise or the first principle of any Code of Conduct would be the status quo. In fact, this is one of the fundamental elements of the Declaration of Conduct of 2002. The status quo at the time was mischief-free. Look where we are now from mischief-free, actually. And therefore, that status quo is going to change. The big power who, will have, obviously because of its resources, would have to consolidate so that that status quo will change over a period of time. So that by then, if you have a Code of Conduct that is going to be concluded 10 years or 15 years from now, you can more or less assume what the status quo is based on what has been transpiring for the last 3 years. Thank you.
Okay. Again, Professor Zhang. And then I have a lady over here.
Okay, just not questions, just short comment on the panelists. I think that it is very important indeed for China to actually pay sufficient attention to the Sino-US relation. That is key for the peace of the region as well as for the peace and prosperity of our country. So that's no problem, absolutely a very important issue. But however, I think that sometimes it can be ruined, as indicated in the recent public opinions, by some so-called, I would say, intentional misunderstanding. I would say, especially in the South China Sea, I really don't understand why people still think that China claimed South China Sea, the U-shaped line, as its internal water or its lake. The foreign minister, I think some 6 months ago in Cambodia, said clearly that China will not impede freedom of navigation in South China Sea. And if you look at the Chinese foreign minister, the spokesperson in the foreign ministry, this position has been repeated quite many times. So it is no problem at all. I really don't understand why people still somehow dot on that position. Second is the so-called U-shaped line. I will say it again, the U-shaped line is definitely not anything accompanied China's rise. It is something that we inherited from the nationalist government position back to 1930s and 40s. That is what we have to accept it vis-a-vis our neighbors as well as to our people. I would like to have you look at the history of this U-shaped line. You will know that 2 dashes erased in 50s and finalized by the agreement, the binding agreement between Vietnam and China on the Tonkin Bay. So I think it's quite logical to think that the line can be, well, it quite depends on the negotiation. It is not something that you take it as, oh, China will insist something there. What is more important or can be seen as the core is the sovereignty to the islands or the rocks, or whatever you call. But however, I think my understanding is my government is quite patient to see the whole South China Sea issue as it is a typical semi-enclosed sea. And if you consider the colonial history, well, I will say it again that Cambodia and Laos, they may also have interest in the South China Sea if the title or the claims has been built by the French claims. So anyway, you see this is quite, you know, my personal view is that my government is patient on that issue to try to have it as a package deal instead of accelerate the computation over the islands, which sometimes has to be, you know, has the danger if it is accelerated to force the parties to resort the means rather than peaceful means. That is anyway my personal view, and thank you all for your very, very important presentation. Thank you.
Yes, you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your comments. People looking at the risk of conflict, sorry, my name is Lynn Kwok and I'm a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. People looking at the East China Sea dispute versus the South China Sea dispute often assess the risk of conflict in the former to be far greater than the latter, simply because the power symmetry is more balanced in the East China Sea. Given that, is it actually wise, do you think it's actually wise for the US to become more involved in the South China Sea by kind of supporting its allies in the region? There have actually been calls, most recently, for example, in the Foreign Affairs, where it's argued that US involvement has raised tensions in the region. If you don't think that such a case can be made, that the US shouldn't become involved in the region, how do you think the US can constructively engage in the South China Sea so that it lessens the risk of conflict there? Is there good involvement versus bad involvement, given that it seems that China seems to get upset with most US involvement in the region? Thank you.
Well, I would just say that I think it's been important for the United States to take a greater interest in these alliances and long-standing friendships we've had in the South China Sea. I think it improves the position of those countries and helps them in dealing with the Chinese. So I think, in answer to your question, there is good involvement there. I don't think it's helpful for the U.S. to be perceived as somehow instrumentalizing these countries in a U.S. Competition with China. And so I think we need to be very careful that any involvement is seen in a sort of positive context of long-standing relationships in Southeast Asia than in as seen as actually using these countries in a kind of anti-China mode. I take the logic of your point about somehow there are two countries in East China Sea and that they're better balanced, and therefore there might be a greater chance of some sort of confrontation. But I think what we're really talking about here is any confrontation, whether in East China Sea or South China Sea, to me is somewhat random. I mean, the result of some kind of mistake, ships bumping into each other, planes bumping into each other, this kind of thing. So you would be basically saying that the chance of random conflict in East China Sea is greater than the chance of random conflict in South China Sea. I'm just not sure I'm comfortable going there. I think in both places really call out for people to sort of take a deep breath and try to have an intensified diplomatic dialogue. And I certainly understand the desire to kind of push this through legal means, but I think what will be a more lasting solution, at least is to get going with more successful diplomacy. And I think, again, I don't want to cast aspersions about China policy to Southeast Asia, but I think it's important, when you read some of the public reaction in China to the countries in Southeast Asia, that's what a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia are hearing. And it's a very kind of nationalistic, these are very nationalistic outbursts that are coming out of China. And I think that is really, to some extent, it's the kind of internet comments that are even causing even greater tension than comments from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which after all says things like, we inherited these claims from the nationalist Chinese government. We're saying there's nothing new here. No, Hillary Clinton, we have never objected or never stood in the way of freedom of navigation. And they try to kind of calm this down and say nothing's new. But when you look at what's happening in sort of the Chinese society more broadly, I think that is what's of concern to these countries. And they're asking whether the Chinese government is doing its part in what every country must do, even North Korea, is calm down people, not spin them up. And I think what is worrisome about China these days is they don't seem to be doing as much of that as they should.
I'd just like to interject on that. I think it's a mistake to treat the East China Sea as more or less dangerous than the South China Sea. They are both dangerous. I noted in my remarks that the United States and China disagree over what are permissible activities in the exclusive economic zones. That has already generated a semi-crisis where a U.S. military vessel was interfered with by some Chinese trawlers that could have led to a very serious incident. The additional problem, and this is related to the point about freedom of navigation that Professor Zhang referred to, is because it has not been clarified which islands within the South China Sea area provide a basis for extending an exclusive economic zone. We don't know how much of the waters of the South China Sea will end up being claimed as exclusive economic zones by various claimants. that is very important to the question of freedom of navigation. For example, if the Chinese position is that military vessels have to request permission before they can transit exclusive economic zones, that will be totally unacceptable to the United States, and the issue of freedom of navigation then arises. So I think there is potential in both areas for serious incidents to occur if governments don't behave with restraint and wisdom.
Yeah, I have 2 points here. You just, Lin just asked about what is a bad involvement, what is a good involvement. My question is that, what if there's no American involvement at all? Can you imagine the situation over there? As a bad or good, Americans involved for Americans' national interests. The judgment is on the American side. The definition is also American side. It would be naive to think Americans will take other countries' interests first to define what is bad, what is good. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind.
Of course, it's in American interest to have peace in the South China Sea. So then it comes back to how will it achieve that peace?
Yeah, but again, that just like Ambassador Roy put it very elegantly over there, it's indeed one peace, but for example, freedom of navigation, it depends how you define which area, what kind of ship can put there, being identified as, defined as a peaceful means or non-peaceful means, because all the countries, including China or even including Singapore, have different understanding and explanation of that, because all of that is based fundamentally on that country's national interests. So it is very difficult to really, that's what I mean, to define what is good, what is bad. Okay, please. And then Tom. Okay, after this, I have one more because it's getting late. I just got the order from my boss.
My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I have one observation, and then I have a question for Ms. Nguyễn Thị Thanh Hà regarding the position of Vietnam. I feel that we're here in New York, and this is obviously an international concern. So it's international water, we're all interconnected in many ways, not just maritime, but tradings and many other ways. And I applaud the Philippines for bringing it up to the rule of the law, global rule of law, to set the stage for other development that we can join ventures in many other aspects, because to observe the rule of law is the key in whatever aspects. So I thank you, Ambassador Roy and Ambassador Christopher Hill and Dr. Lee for that. Now to that, I think the Chinese people, lawyer Chen Guangcheng had emphasized the rule of law. So 1.3 billion of Chinese people very much wanted China government to observe the rule of law. And so does the Vietnamese people. There's a movement asking for Vietnamese government to observe the rule of law. So I applaud you to follow and push for the negotiation in the lower aspect. The question is, would Vietnam follow the Philippines and ask our ASEAN countries to follow and bring this to the global rule of law discussion? And besides, not just the freedom of navigations, but the realistic side of it is that the Vietnamese people, the fishermen, are being harassed. They have no livelihoods around there. People cannot fish in their own water, and that truly is important. It's something that we need to resolve now, not just waiting till the right time. We need China not to stop Chinese Vietnamese fishermen fishing in our own water. It's very important for the livelihood of the people. Human trafficking happens right there because the people cannot earn a living and they sell off their daughters. And human trafficking and many other situations happening. So it's very important. So I would urge that our panel, our panelists today and tomorrow talk more about how to find the basis for international law, how to enforce it so that we can set the stage for future cooperation with China, so we can embrace 1.3 billion of Chinese people as you had wished, you had hoped for the change to join us in the rule of law. So is there a way, Ambassador Roy, that we can somehow, the U.S., as taking the leadership to embrace China, to ask them? I heard that the important point is the dialogue between U.S. and China. So is there a way that we can talk to the new leader of China, asking him to somehow observe the UNCLOS? He's a partner of it. China and Vietnam too is a member of the UNCLOS. So I would very much ask the Vietnamese government to join the Philippines and to take Chinese government to the international law, the International Court of Law, and talk about this officially, because the Vietnamese people very much would like you to do it.
Okay. That's a good point, very good point. Okay, do you want to have a brief answer to that?
Well, if you say that Vietnam should follow the Philippines, I would say that Vietnam is an independent state. We make our decision upon the consideration of the realities, and also we are a state party to the Convention on the Law of the Sea. We have to follow the provisions of the Law of the Sea, and we try all the venues, all the procedures in order to find a peaceful solution. So there is not, the legal track is one way, but that is not the only way. We have many other ways, and we can try. And I think as long as we are taking a peaceful means to try to find a solution to the disputes, it is in accordance with international law.
Okay, Tom, you have the last word.
And I have a loud voice, I don't need a microphone. It's just a quick question, but given that in the spirit of the last question and so many other questions, time is really of the essence, right? And you, Professor Wong, said earlier, and this is maybe a question for you or Ambassador Roy, you said that Xi Jinping is a new leader and therefore a weak leader. And a weak leader must be a tough leader. So if you, and we've read that elsewhere, if one accepts that premise, what sort of time are we talking about? How much time before we think Xi Jinping and the new leadership will be able to be more bold about this and be able to not worry so much about the tough posture? I mean, is that it's probably an unanswerable question, but in your view, is that a year, 2 years? It's a 10-year term, obviously. What are we talking about?
I think that the three factors will involve this. Number one, that how Xi Jinping see his leadership position. Is it solid or still need consolidation? I think that obviously he still need to consolidate his power. He just barely came to power. And in that period, of course, it would be disastrous for them to be viewed as soft on the foreign policy issue, internally and externally. I think that's a universal in almost all politics. The second factor, of course, is his personality. Personality matters. And my understanding that Xi Jinping's personality is quite tough. His appearance could be deceptive. Internally, he's a very tough guy. And moreover, I think he's very nationalistic, because he grew up in a family that has fought the Japanese community from so-called revolutionary family. And he grew up during all those very volatile years. That really, really made him extraordinarily tough, in my view. Last but not the least, it depends what kind of relationship he's going to develop with major powers leaders. For example, what is the relationship with Obama, with Abe, or with Vietnamese leader. Usually, you know, the good personal relationship among the top leaders matter greatly. The good example is his relationship with President Park from North Korea. The two has very much immediately built up a kind of good chemistry. And together, that, in my view, has played a very important role in China's new position on North Korea. So that's the three factors we have to watch for.
I'd make one comment. Professor Wong has referred to the fact that new leaders are weak leaders and therefore have to be tough leaders. But there's another Chinese saying, which is that new officials arrive brandishing 3 torches, meaning they want to make an impact quickly after they take office. So I think that we shouldn't exclude the possibility that once you have the new foreign policy team in place, which is about to emerge, that partly driven by events and partly driven by wanting to put a personal stamp on things, that we might see some initiatives from the Chinese that at the moment are not predictable.
Okay, and let's bring this to the end finally, and we know still have lots of issues here. Please join me, give a warm round to all the panelists.